Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I had with Jessica Leahy, Professor of Human Dimensions of Natural Resources at the University of Maine. I've known Jessica for years, and having the opportunity to hear about her work in detail was a joy. The social science aspect of natural resources is an incredibly rich field, and hearing Jessica talk about her work and how it helps Maine can make anyone inspired about science. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm delighted to have you. You're in this really cool position at the University of Maine where you're in the School of Forest, right? Forest resources, but you really deal with human dimensions, which I find fascinating and something that I think a lot of people don't realize a School of Forestry has. But before I let you talk about that, I would love to know your background and how you ended up from Alaska to the West Coast to the Midwest and finally settling in the great state of Maine.
Well, that's a long story. It's always fascinating. The roots of what is seemingly fate is really just many nudges along the way. And so, yes, I grew up in Alaska. I grew up 10 miles outside of the town of Eagle River. My parents bought a 2-room cabin and added on to it over the years. And I had that lovely childhood upbringing of being kicked out of the house and having to go play in the woods and developing this real appreciation and comfort with being in nature. And then I had an incredibly influential high school teacher, science teacher, who also would spend the summers doing sea kayak guiding. And she hired me to be an assistant sea kayak guide in my junior and senior year of high school. And that got me thinking that I was noticing sort of a recreation conflict that was fascinating and motivating. So issues where I would show up and we couldn't find campsites, so we'd have to keep paddling, or we'd go to a Forest Service cabin in the Alaskan wilderness and it wouldn't be in a good condition or something like that. So I was like, oh yeah, I want to be a park ranger. So I went to Oregon State University and their outdoor recreation program was in the College of Forestry, and it had a heavy forest flavor to it.
Is that unusual? I mean, I know we have it here.
Yeah.
Is that usually where outdoor rec is parked?
Yeah. And so it goes back to about the 1960s, where with the rise of the middle class, the increase in automobile-based camping recreation, the natural resource agencies like the National Park Service, U.S. Forest Service, but even state parks, they started having people, recreation and visitors, come to the parks, and then they needed to manage that. So it got rooted in those natural resource agencies as opposed to other options coming out of city parks and recreation department and things like that. So yeah, I was at Oregon State doing that, and there was always this theme of people in nature. And I also like the quantitative stuff. You know, when I was in high school, people were like, you should go into engineering because you like math. It was like there was only one option, you know, engineering or medicine or something. It's like, oh, actually, there's a lot of options out there if you like science and math, especially if you have additional interests like the forest or the woods or nature. There's all of the environmental science and environmental study careers available. I got picked up by 2 different professors who, in my junior year of college, had me work on research projects and support grad students. And that was really like the pivot point for me becoming a professor. I loved what those grad students were doing. One of those projects was about the Northwest Forest Plan in Oregon and how local communities were adapting to the changes in forest policy. And then in the other one, it was more tourism-based. We did a tourism barometer for Oregon, trying to predict what that season's tourism was going to be. But again, a lot of Oregon's tourism is nature-based. And so people and nature were all connecting in there. I stayed for my master's. I then worked for 2 years, which I appreciated that time. And then I got a call from the University of Minnesota where, again, there was a really interesting project of people in nature. So in that case, the project that was going to provide me with 3 years of stability in terms of funding was with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and a watershed association where a very large stretch of the Kaskaskia River in central and southern Illinois had 2 different lakes as well as a sort of barge canal and 3 different watershed groups had all brought together the local community that included farmers, people who would be affected by flooding if the water wasn't controlled properly, but also huge recreation on the reservoirs. They all reached agreement at the local level, and then all three of them reached agreement to manage water flow on this river to minimize flooding, maximize recreation, benefit the farmers in the area. It was a very interesting case of people working together as it related to nature.
How far along were they before you got involved?
They had reached a consensus and provided their recommendations to the Army Corps of Engineers on the water release schedule. And the Army Corps of Engineers usually has a lot of conflict that they're like grappling with. And they were like, you could imagine being the colonel in the St. Louis office being handed this amazingly durable, where people were going to agree because they had already reached agreement about it. They loved it and they had implemented it. So the Army Corps of Engineers was funding this project, and they wanted to know how they might be able to get that to happen in other areas.
So is that what you looked at, like the implementation of it and what is possibly replicable?
What I studied was, we went in with a hypothesis that there were two things that made all of that possible. The first was trust, and trust in natural resource management. Do we trust agencies to manage the wildlife, to manage the water, to manage the trees? What goes into that? Because when you have trust, you're able to collaborate and manage resources together. The other was that by bringing people together, that they built social capital, or that they could use social capital to reach these agreements on water management. So we were really using both of those lenses to get the deep dive on how it worked. And trust ends up, that is a wonderful thing to have studied for a dissertation because it holds so well. We found that a key thing is just how trusting people are in general. People kind of have like a general disposition. We also had technical competence. And so people's belief in the agency employees to have expertise and carry that out. But moral competency was also really important. And so how the agency employees talked about their morals and how they demonstrated their morals. You could have all the science knowledge in the world, but you also needed to be guided by caring for the resource, caring for the local communities.
Did the morals have to align really well with the other people? Or did it just have to exist that there was a moral compass? I don't know if that's the right phrase, but it didn't necessarily have to be the same as everyone's else, but it had to be something that was recognized?
Yeah, exactly. So caring for a community, that might mean different things to different people, but that's a goal matters. But then also what mattered was what we call in the social science world, procedural justice, that you're following a fair process. And people will accept decisions that don't favor them if the process was fair, just, allowed them to maintain their dignity as they shared their opinion about how the resource should be managed. Even if it doesn't go their way, they can abide by it if there's this procedural justice.
That's super interesting. I did a bunch of environmental work before I got into this gig, and you could tell which programs were going to work and which weren't, and they certainly were centered on trust and a sense of fairness and fair play. I want to go back to social capital really quickly and have you explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of definitions of social capital. It's a really flexible framework that social scientists use, but mostly that other forms of capital are like financial capital, political capital. Your human capital is the education that you have and things like that. And the social capital is the networks that you have, the exchanges of reciprocity, and they build together. So a group that has high social capital has a lot of ties to one another and is able to sort of leverage their connectivity to achieve goals that they couldn't if they were working individually. It can also be a negative thing. And so you could have high social capital that is used where people pull together and work in a negative way.
So did that pan out? Your hypothesis was trust and social capital. I know that you said the trust did the social capital come into play as well?
Yes. So that hadn't been investigated very much at the time that I did my dissertation. So one thing that we worked on were developing qualitative methods, and then we created measurement tools that agency people could use to measure how components of trust and components of social capital, so that they could monitor if there were changes over time as they had their own collaborative association or something like that going.
That's really cool and a more direct, useful application of dissertations than people automatically see when we're talking about PhD. I mean, this is the fascinating thing. Most of my understanding of PhD programs is with super hardcore lab sciences, right? So people will be like, oh, yeah, that's really interesting. And they'll learn a little bit from it, but it doesn't get into the outside world necessarily, right? It stays housed in that little area. So this type of thing is really interesting that it gets pushed out into the world. Why did they call you? You said the University of Minnesota called you for grad school and you were working. I'm just curious, like, had you kind of let it be known to people that you wanted to do a PhD? Was it aligned with the work you were doing? That's an interesting route into a PhD program that I haven't heard anyone say before.
Yeah, well, forestry is a small community. And so it was my future PhD advisor had called my master's advisor, asking for recommendations of who might be available. And that small forestry world is so true. It hasn't changed in the 20 years I've been an academic, and there is a lot of word of mouth. And thank goodness I treated my master's degree like a professional job and had a really good relationship with my master's advisor. I selected my master's advisor carefully to be someone that I had really close research interest with, that I worked really well with. So she was able to give me a recommendation. And then at that PhD level, after that call and that recommendation, I followed up with who would become my PhD advisor. And she insisted that I fly out to the University of Minnesota for an interview for both of our sake, where we could interview each other and meet, and I could talk to grad students in her lab, because that's a 3 to 4 or longer year, very close relationship where you're getting mentored in research, but also how to be an academic. And she wanted to make sure that I would be a good person to hire, but I also wanted to make sure that it would be a good match for me.
Was it unusual that both your advisors were women in a forest school?
Yes, but certainly was probably a factor in my decisions. So I looked up to both of them as role models. It has to be, in selecting them as mentors, could I see myself being them one day? And it was a little bit easier. For forest resources is male dominated. And so it was a little easier. They were inspirational too, because they were both very much had been hired like in the early 80s, both of them, and were pioneers. And like I was saying, it's research mentoring, but it's also mentoring in how to succeed in academia. So they did have a lot to offer me, was in addition to what other advisors might be able to offer because of their experiences being women in science.
That's pretty cool. All right. How did Maine get you? How did we get lucky enough to get you? And where to go from looking at reservoirs to studying a place where we're super forested and a lot of it is private land? What I've learned is it's not typical to have such large swaths of land that are open to recreation that are not public.
Yeah, I could tell all sorts of funny stories about growing up in Alaska. It's very challenging to get outside to the lower 48. So I had not explored the East at all. And so when I applied for the University of Maine, I was really taking a guess that there was snow here, there were moose here, there were some things, but I had stereotypes like many people from away do, that the fashion would be more like Boston, that there would be all these wool peacoats and stuff. I didn't study my LL Bean catalogs well enough to know that flannel would be far more common. And then I also had never had lobster before. I came for my on-campus interview. And a neat feature of when you're interviewing to be a professor is that you have like a 2-day interview and there are meals. And it's a big deal, which is different than non-academic positions where you might have an hour-long interview or something like that. So I wasn't going to suggest eating a lobster, but the committee found out that I had never had one. And so they insisted that I have a lobster for dinner, which is a very challenging thing to eat. So I had to put on a bib, and I also didn't know how to crack open the lobster. So I had 3 different professors who would be my future colleagues helping me, and it was quite hilarious. But my one good interview outfit did not get lobster water on it, and
Yeah, that's really good. I imagine the 3 different people had different approaches.
yes, all of the opinions for that.
Yeah.
But anyways, I got here, I interviewed. There are a lot of similarities between Maine and Alaska. The ruralness, the access to nature, the importance of the flagship university to the state, less so in Alaska, but here the importance of forestry. Forestry is alive and well in Maine. You know, we're 90% forested. Forest industry is huge, all of that. So it just seemed like I have always been in a school of forest resources or a department of forest management. So to be in one of the best ones in the country, in a state that we've got the history, but we have the future ahead of us. So why would I not want to be a part of that? But to your question about private land, absolutely. So most of my projects had been public land and public land based. So I had to really revamp what I was doing. But it's great being a social scientist because the way that I approach it, what I do first is I scan. If I were to move somewhere else or just for new issues in Maine, new research projects, I first scan for problems. So where are there problems that managers, communities, state policymakers, where are there problems that involve forests and people? That's my first filter for things.
That could be a giant amount, right? I mean, could be, not necessarily, but that doesn't narrow it down a whole lot necessarily.
Well, there's more to it, more to the filtering. You know, the University of Maine is small and we get to serve the state in a lot of ways. And so that's another reason that the University of Maine ended up being a good fit for me is that I get to have a lot of diversity in what I do. The theme is solving problems that involve people and forests, but I don't do trust studies 100% of the time. I don't do social capital 100% of the time. I'm driven by the problem. And then a good problem has to, for me to work on it, not someone else, it has to have a social science theory that I could use to shed some light on the problem. So that actually filters some out. There are some forest plus people problems that are going to be better addressed by people using other theories or other disciplines. But there are others that rely on psychology or communication theories and things like that, where it's like, okay. Then I think about population. So who then are the targets? And so usually I'm focused on private woodland owners, recreation users, and local community members of forest adjacent communities. And that, you know, we can filter that out. There are other groups of people that are not typical for me. And then I pick which methods I'm going to use. And I use qualitative methods, quantitative methods, and sometimes I've done some newer stuff, computational social science, like agent-based modeling, that's sort of newer.
Can you explain that one?
Yeah, agent-based modeling is where it does a lot of scenarios and you create model landscapes where you program agents or people to, in a computer model, run through rule sets where there's a lot of randomness. And you can look to see what the outcome is with multiple scenarios, which will then help you understand what might be going on in the one scenario that is playing out in real life.
That's super cool. That almost seems like assigning the computer to do role playing at a faster pace so you can at least start to predict what might happen.
Exactly. Yeah. And so you have it's a social ecological thing. In the computer model, you have, just picture it as like squares are the landscape. You can actually tell the landscape to do certain things too. So you could have trees growing in each cycle. They could grow a little bigger, and you could have rules for when they're available for harvest. You could also have, like on the private land issue, one thing that Maine relies on for recreation is public access to private land. But that is based on our tradition and our social norm of allowing access. If land is not posted, people are able to use it. But when a neighbor posts and puts up a no trespassing sign, that then moves the recreationists over to the other square, and it increases the probability that that neighbor will post. So we can start to model that in a way that we don't want to experiment with in real life. We don't want to have small woodland owners. We don't want to give them no trespassing signs to put up to see what happens, because we have this wonderful system where people can hunt and fish using the Great Ponds Act, ability to cross private land to access the Great Ponds. But even snowmobiling, ATV, snowshoeing, bird watching, all of that, there's a lot of use of private land.
Were you surprised when you got here at seeing how much private land was in use for recreation?
Yes, while I had grown up in Alaska, which has a lot of federal ownership and therefore the ability to use that land, and in Oregon, there was a higher amount of private land. There's hunting leases. There's a lot of gates in Oregon. If you want to use, say, Starker forest land, you have to get a permit. I mean, I really was very respectful of private property rights and was uncomfortable, even as a personal user outside of work, going onto private land until I got assured that you could, yes, if it's not posted, you can. And then I started to do it in order to go to places that I wanted to recreate. And I got to see that it really was the tradition. And years.
Does it matter to you personally what it is you want to do out there? Like, would it be different for you if you want to go snowmobiling versus hiking and doing deep in-country camping? Like, would that matter to you, do you think?
Possibly. I mean, there are different rules for different activities. So ATV riding is one where you do need written permission to be on private land unless it's posted open. That's sort of... I
mean, you can tell I don't have one since I don't know that, but
yeah.
What you've been at UMaine not quite 20 years, which always, now that I'm past that stage, I'm always like, that sounds like a long time, but It's not that long. Can you pick like two really different projects that provide a little synopsis into the life of a social scientist in a forest resources school? And maybe as part of that, an overview or insight or some type of explanation about why forests in Maine continue to be so valuable in ways that I don't think we totally understand. You know, certainly if you're outside of Maine and you haven't been here, the first thought people have is the coastline. And there's a long history about why that's true, and I get it. But the forest industry has been so critical for all of our existence and before we were recognized as a state. And I personally see a whole lot of really amazing stuff coming in the future, but I don't know that it's understood. I mean, I realize I threw a lot at you, but kind of a description of what you do from a social scientist perspective would be great. But then also an explanation of forestry in Maine and why it's so important would be really cool.
Well, I'll start with two very different projects that shed light on what it's like to be a forest social scientist at the University of Maine. The first is a bit more about that public access to private land. It just really fits that model of identifying a problem that matters to the state. And so we had a quality of place report. We had the Forest on the Edge report. The state economist issued a report on public access to private land. Jim Acheson published something in Maine Policy Review, and the newspapers, whether the Portland Press Herald or the Bangor Daily News, for a good period of time, right when I arrived in 2005, for at least a 5-year period, there was just all sorts of signals and messages that public access to private land was an issue, and it was something where research could help. So I had 2 different master's students as well as some undergrads work on both sides of the equation. So for this wonderful tradition and social norm that we have, you have to have landowners participating and agreeing to have recreation. You also need the land user perspective. So the recreationists and what they're experiencing, what they think the norms are, what they're willing to do in order to preserve the norm. And then you need to match the two of those up. So we did that. And one thing that is amazing and that I love about Maine is our citizen legislature and our legislative process, where when there are issues, any sort of issue, a legislator or nonprofits that work with legislators can suggest solutions, write a bill, and share it. And then we have a really clear process, which has only been made more amazing by the pandemic, because now many of the sessions with testimony and work sessions, you can Zoom in. I watched many this spring. And once a bill is introduced, then anyone who wants to talk for, against, or neither for nor against can share in a 3-minute spiel their perspective on it. And then the work sessions, you can have a back and forth and all of that. So that actually happened after this had been a controversy. Some solutions were developed, introduced into the legislature, and they reached out to me and the University of Maine to share our research and what does it suggest and how could it shape what the solution was. So we did that. We were able to, in that particular case, I had provided not directly to the legislators, but to the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, Department of Ag Conservation and Forestry, as well as all of the groups that care about this, the Maine Professional Guides Association, Maine Woodland Owners, got them all of the research results, allowed them to digest it. We gave a presentation at the Sportsman Alliance of Maine, sharing those results, and let them think about how they wanted to use the science to shape the policy. And they did. One thing they did was move the landowner relations program from Department of Ag Conservation and Forestry over to the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, which is where the game wardens are, and also where many of the issues are hunting related. And their IF&W is who manages hunting wildlife resources and hunting rules and regulations. So they moved that over there. And then they created this landowner relations program with staffing. And the staff then used the research to shape what they did for educational outreach and other things like that. They also created an advisory board, which then I got to be appointed by the Commissioner of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife to the advisory board. So as the program unfolded, I got to participate, and there were some myths out there. Like one myth that people had was that it was people from away, people from out of state who were posting their land. In fact, it's people who live on their land that the research suggests are more likely to post because they want privacy and they don't want hunters near where they live. I mean, it's actually kind of logical once you think about it, but there was a lot of blaming of out-of-state residents, and then solutions like how they might affect the tree growth tax law in out-of-state, like all of that. But, it could have missed the mark. Legislative efforts could have easily focused on people from away instead of what some of the issues were, which was privacy and helping people to maintain a sense of safety and things like that. So that was that example. And just like, the smallness of Maine, how everybody knows one another, and how the university the research is valued and gets used. Completely different from that's kind of a landowner recreation user one. More recently, I've been interested in rural communities and problems that they're facing that relate to rural youth, attracting back or keeping youth in their communities. We got approached by the Appalachian Mountain Club, who is in Piscataquis County with their Maine Woods Initiative. They offer youth programming in the area. They wanted to know the impact of some of their K-12 programming. They also try to hire high school workers to work in the summers. They had questions about that. I was collaborating with Dr. Mindy Crandall, who moved to Oregon State University. And so we found a paired community, Coos Bay, Oregon. And we used Piscataquis County and Coos Bay. And then we built these partnerships. So in both cases, we had a nonprofit like Appalachian Mountain Club, Coos Watershed Association. And then we created a community steering committee with all the diverse sectors of people we could think of. Wrote a grant, got funding from USDA in the Resource Economics and Community program. And we worked with 5 different schools in Piscataquis County to actually ask the youth themselves what they thought of their community, what they thought of the outdoor opportunities, and what they were thinking for the future. And it was super interesting because from the science side, if I were to be critical of past scientists, they have really muddled they had not been as strict and rigorous as possible with differentiating between people's attachment to their community and their attachment to the natural environment. Often they were just measured all together, like how much do you love living in Dover Foxcroft, or not separating the two. So our improvement was to very much separate people's sense of the community, how much they like the school, safety, access to healthcare, all of that, versus what we call outdoor place attachment, which is from their outdoor activities. We measured the youth outdoor activity. And by separating them, we were able to see that both matter. For a youth to want to stay in their community, they do need to be attached and feel like they belong in their community. But we also were able to detect signals related to the importance of the outdoor place attachment. Interestingly, I'll just as an aside, I think one outcome that we had, there are certainly people in rural communities who are listening to youth, and that's very important. Like if you look at even mental health studies that have been coming out about Maine and mental health and high schoolers, someone listening to these teenagers makes a really big difference. Even in our study where we were talking to them and surveying them, I got blown away by the contributions that these high schoolers were able to make to the study and their thoughts and, the seriousness with which they thought about their communities and their prospects for the community. How, you wouldn't think of a teenager being able to recognize the importance of local healthcare, but they clearly articulated as they were planning their future. We did include one northern Somerset County community, which was Jackman. They're 70 miles from a hospital, and that's where you have to go if you want to have a kid. And these teenagers, they weren't planning on having a family anytime soon, but when they thought about staying in Jackman, maybe they shouldn't return after college because they would want to have a child in the future. And that sort of forward thinking was whoa, that is great. And we absolutely need to listen more and better.
It's really fascinating. It affirms what I've thought for a long time, probably as I watched my kids grow up. We don't give them enough credit for how thoughtful they are, because it's really easy to see the dumb stuff they do, as all teenagers do, right? But they are vastly more thoughtful and aware of their surroundings and what's important to them than we've ever given them credit for.
Yes, I do have to say that there were a number when we asked about, career aspirations, that many people wanted to be video game players and YouTube stars and things that maybe were, NBA.
Maybe the importance there is recognizing that all the answers are valid to that teenager, but only some of them are really going to apply to the work that you're doing.
Yeah. So that one, I don't have any legislative applications, but I do know that there's a group in Piscataquis County, Helping Hands with Hearts, that used our research results to write a grant that went to the Fed, and they were able to use that work in their grant application, which is bringing pretty significant resources to Piscataquis County to implement different programs. And they were going to have additional process community discussions to figure out exactly what was the best program. But they did use our research in order to get the funding for programming. So I feel really good about that. And it's the advantage of being at the University of Maine and in Maine, where we can have that sort of close connection, where we don't just plop in on a community and then go back to Orono and process the data and write a research paper and never share it back.
Yeah, it's a really great example of how much impact you can have with social science and understanding the community, that it's just not there for other fields. I mean, for all of those reasons, but maybe because they're not fostering a connection because that's not what their job is. But it's really interesting. And I would imagine deeply gratifying for you to have research that you can actually see the result of that doesn't take 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, but we're all working together. So I have amazing School of Forestry source colleagues. We have silviculture expertise in Nicole Rogers, who's looking at rehabilitation forestry and forestry under climate change. How do we adapt the forest? We have Jay Wasons, the ecophysiologist, who's trying to understand how trees will respond to drought. So those are important things to understand.
Oh, I don't mean those aren't important. I
know, but I can't help with that.
No, but it's kind of great that you have an opportunity to see, I don't know. One of the reasons I marvel at people in academia and a PhD is because you need to be able to do the long game.
Yeah.
to just see results. And I find that amazing. Like if you're able to stick to the long game like that, that is not trivial. So to be able to get these projects where you do have relatively immediate results is pretty great and not really typical.
Yeah, although to be fair, the public access to private land, I think I started in on that in 2007. So that's pretty long. The other project that I was remarking on that's taken a long time, but continues, and I intended for it to be a short project, is our work with wood banks. And wood banks are like food banks, but it's where people who are in need can access firewood. And that was a senior capstone project started by a Maine student, Mitchell scholar, Blue Hill native from George Stevens Academy, came to UMaine, and she wanted a senior capstone that involved renewable energy and poverty. And I had heard about this Keene, New Hampshire wood bank, and I said, well, run with it. She ended up working on it for a year and a half with different components, and she organized a regional summit of wood banks. Based on that, she wrote a community guide to starting and running a wood bank. She used census data and the American Community Survey to make maps, trying to estimate where there was wood bank potential. And I thought the project would end there, but it hasn't. Wood banks started reading her work and forming. This community guide that she posted at Fogler Library's Digital Commons has now been downloaded more than 1,400 times globally. One nice thing about Digital Commons is we can see the location of where people are downloading. So it's all across the northern US, but also in colder countries around the world. It's amazing. In the pandemic, the New York Times picked up on it and wrote an article about Maine wood banks. Like it just has been building momentum. There was a national study of wood banks. They think there's about 150 of them around the country. And when the bipartisan infrastructure law was being developed, a group of us from Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Conservation Resources, UMass Amherst, Harvard Forest, and myself all did a sign-on letter advocating for wood bank funding. And we didn't hear anything until we got a call from the U.S. Forest Service that $8 million was written into the bipartisan infrastructure law to build out wood banks around the country. And now we're getting enough funding to the University of Maine to hire an outreach coordinator, and we're going to do a national wood bank summit. We're trying to get more educational resources out to support wood banks. The bulk of that money is going to a nonprofit, the Alliance for Green Heat, who is giving direct grants to wood banks to fund them buying chainsaws and splitters and whatever they need. Just yesterday, I went out and visited the Down East Wood Bank, which is in Surrey, and the Home Wood Bank, which is in Orland. And they were both grant recipients, and they've been able to increase how much firewood that they're making for their residents. They're both in expansion mode now. Home is, I think, going to be able to help 40 families with 1 cord of wood each, in part because they have this added capacity from the grant, and they're able to work up 40 cords. Down East Wood Bank is about at 40 cords right now, but they've got big plans. They're going to start providing wood to residents in Ellsworth. They think that might even double the demand on the wood bank, and they're going to try to meet it. But I make sure the student's name was Sabrina Vivian, and she's gone on for her master's degree at University of Michigan and now works for an environmental consultant in Denver. But we stay in touch, and I make sure she knows that if she hadn't have done that senior capstone project, I think this whole ball that's gained momentum might not have happened.
So that is a perfect example, not only of an immediate impact, but of how critically important it is to have undergraduates comfortable to do research with faculty who give them enough leash to just run with it, right? I mean, that's crazy trust from faculty, where I went to college and was as much my era as anything else. You were lucky if a faculty thought you might be able to wash dishes by your junior year because stuff's expensive and you don't get to do it regularly. So that's one thing I've actually noticed a lot with people I talk to at the University of Maine is not just a willingness of faculty to fully embrace the responsibility of having undergraduates involved, because it is not trivial because they don't know anything. So it's extra work, but you all embrace it with this almost wild-eyed abandon of yeah, let's do it. I think it's a really great testament to a culture of research and understanding what a flagship university does.
Absolutely. Yeah. In Sabrina's case, I think a lot of it was stuff that she learned in class, but she got to independently apply it. So she took the GIS class. And so, she made 16 maps for every county in Maine. We got the support from other peers. So in the case of Sabrina's maps, we've had help from Dr. Kathleen Bell in the School of Economics and Dr. Mindy Crandall when she was here. Now she's at OSU, but she still helped us with some of that. Yeah, it is a little intimidating to download U.S. Census data and figure out how to bring it into ArcGIS. You have the fundamentals from GIS and you're able to do it, but there are a few leaps that have to be made. But when I've asked another professor to help one of my research undergrads, they've always been really willing. So it's bringing it all together and all of that. But some of it, I think, is the faculty, for the most part, really care about Maine. And so where I've had undergrad research involvement, often we've got that matched values. Sabrina was so motivated with her capstone because she cared so much about the project, but also how it might help Maine. I can totally get on board with that.
How about helping us understand how industry, and by that I mean the pulp and paper industry and the forest bioproducts industry, can exist in the same environment as land trusts that may or may not even allowing mountain bikes to people who just kind of want to go for a nice little walk? How does that all exist in Maine? And how does that exist going forward?
So I think I would start very abstractly in that forests can provide a lot for society. And that is a very broad, intentionally broad way of thinking about it. And so that includes forest industry and utilization and forest products in the traditional sense. But I think there are other ecosystem services with what they can do to contribute to water quality, carbon storage, things like that. Then there's the use, like the outdoor recreation and the nature-based tourism that relies on it. But then there's also the emotional sort of way that forests can help us feel better. So forests just are multi-purpose, which is great. But I think we think of forest industry as dominating. And I don't know that we give full recognition to the already existing synergies and cooperation that go particularly between traditional forest products and recreation. However, if we talk to rural youth in our study, if I go back to that project, we asked them about their preferences for if the choices were only forest industry and outdoor recreation industry, how would they balance those and what they thought the current balance was. And they indicated, not in precise numbers, but that both coexisted, that it was about 50-50. When we asked some of the teachers and principals, we would do the surveys in the school and then we could review the results right after the homeroom session with the principal or the superintendent, whoever wanted. And they said, well, these students know that because many of them have two parents and one works in forest industry and one works on a tourism-based job. Like, of course they can tell you that. They know what their parents do. So I think there's that. I am very curious what is going to happen to the forest in the future biologically with climate change, but also in terms of changing forest policy and changing forest ownerships. And I don't have the answer to that. We have had a shift in ownership from being owned by the forest product manufacturing companies, where they divested and it went to timber investment management organizations and real estate investment trusts. And that's beginning to shift even as well, more towards those that have family offices and things like that, and shifts towards conservation owners. I'm not sure what the future has in store for the forests of Maine. We've had forests for a long time. We've had varying degrees of stewardship. The forest has remained. We have some of the largest conservation easements, so we know that it will be forest. We don't know how good a forest or what kind of forest, but will be forest. So I don't know. It's going to give me lots to study.
Then I will ask you to come back and you can tell me about it.
Yeah, in at least 10 years.
That's right. We'll be around for a bit.
Yeah.
Jessica, this has been great. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was fun.
Oh, I'm glad you thought so. The other thing I noticed with academics, I thought it used to just be physicists, but you guys are really good at pausing and thinking about questions. Like I've had to learn and occasionally look up in the sky, like the answer's there. Like,
oh yeah, that's where my memories are, how I access in my brain.
No, it's great.
They're stored in different areas in the file cabinets up there.
It's one of my favorite things. I'm like, where are they going to look today to get the answer? So I appreciate that.
I think there is something about where, I forget which direction it is, but people do look in certain for old or new memories or something.
It's super fascinating to be an observer to all of that. So this was great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on your podcast platform of choice. And please leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. Maine Science Podcast is executive produced and hosted by me, Kate Dickerson, and edited and produced by Scott Loiselle. The Discover Maine theme was composed and performed by Nick Parker.